reading the second part of your message, my heart sank. And I'm really sorry. For sure fell short. And you worked really hard on that. And the way you framed it and how that made you feel, I just want to say thank you for sharing that with me. That takes...
They thought no one would notice. They thought their silence would shield them, but the internet never forgets. And now the truth is louder than ever. Blake Lively's carefully curated world is collapsing as secret emails, anonymous leaks, and damning testimony expose a campaign of manipulation no one saw coming. This isn't gossip. This is evidence. This isn't backlash. This is accountability. And with every document released, every creator who speaks out, and every brand that walks away, the walls are closing in fast, because this time the story isn't written by Hollywood. It's written by the people they tried to silence, and now the ending is out of their hands. The moment the door closed behind her, Blake Lively knew the silence would not protect her anymore, because what had been whispered in back rooms was now being screamed across courtrooms, and what had once been brushed aside as speculation was suddenly evidence on the record screenshots. Emails, whispers turned testimony. Every creator who had once felt powerless was now reclaiming their voice, not in anger alone, but armed with facts, with timestamps, and with a rising collective memory that refused to forget. And each new revelation didn't just dent her reputation. It cracked the very foundation of the narrative she and her team had spent years crafting. The Golden Girl, the Hollywood darling, the queen of curated charm, suddenly stood on the edge of a truth that no stylist, no filter, no controlled interview could erase. And the worst part was the timeline it lined up too perfectly. Like a thread someone thought would never be followed, but had been pulled anyway. Unraveling more and more until the core was exposed, and at that core sat not just Blake's name, but her decisions, deliberate signatures, approval chains, emails that couldn't be denied. No matter how many lawyers tried to spin or redact or reshape the perception. Because this wasn't perception anymore. It was a legal proceeding, and perception had lost its power in the face of proof. And what made it all the more damning was that this wasn't just about one YouTuber, or a simple misunderstanding, or a one-time brand dispute. This was about a pattern, a documented recurring strategy, alleged by multiple creators across platforms, across campaigns over months and years, a strategy that, if proven true, would redefine not just her brand, but her legacy itself. And the more the internet dug, the more they found. It wasn't just creators. Speaking up now, it was people from her past. Former brand partners, staffers, even ex-collaborators. Some still anonymous, some brave enough to go public. They began dropping hints, timelines, stories, small details that on their own seemed like nothing, but together painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. One user released internal documents showing that publicists tied to her team allegedly pushed for content suppression through blacklisting strategies, pressuring companies to deny brand deals based on creator opinions. Another source leaked archived chats from a marketing agency directly affiliated with one of her most successful product launches. These messages described keyword suppression tactics planned in advance against creators who had questioned or critiqued her online. And what was haunting was that those suppression strategies worked to the letter. Channels saw sudden drops in reach analytics that once soared, dipped into shadow. Entire playlists demonetized, then mysteriously restored with no explanation. Creators were left in the dark, appealing, begging, emailing, trying to understand what had happened, until one by one they started comparing notes, timelines, overlaps, anomalies. And what emerged was more than a coincidence. It was a blueprint, a digital paper trail of influence misused. And these weren't fringe accounts or small voices. These were people with hundreds of thousands, even millions of subscribers. People with data, spreadsheets, comparisons, analytics that showed exactly when things changed and why. And soon they stopped emailing platforms and started documenting for lawyers. Legal teams picked up where outrage left off, collecting and filing, building timelines that no longer lived on Twitter threads, but in court filings, sealed and unsealed, paragraph after paragraph connecting the dots. And as each story became sworn affidavit, each screenshot a piece of discovery, the narrative shifted. No longer a fandom drama, but a legal crisis with the potential to redefine influencer relationships forever. And through all this, Ryan Reynolds, who had remained curiously silent, found himself dragged into the mess. his name appearing in email threads and promotional strategies where, allegedly, creators flagged for criticism saw brand deals pulled last minute, often after internal notes from projects he was tied to were shared. And while no one had claimed he orchestrated anything, the proximity alone was dangerous, because silence now looked like complicity. And complicity in the age of receipts was a stain. No amount of charm could scrub off mainstream media that once fawned over the couple began to pivot. Journalists who once praised their activism started asking about creator suppression and digital censorship, and when they got no answers, they dug deeper. Some citing anonymous sources, others cross-checking data already posted online, and suddenly the story was everywhere. The glossy veneer of celebrity gave way to questions about ethics and power and silence, and as Blake's team issued vague denials, public anger only intensified, because what people wanted wasn't a press release. They wanted the truth, and when that didn't come, they looked elsewhere. Court filings, social posts, former employees all became sources in a growing investigation, not just of what was done, but how deeply it was buried, and the legal system began to respond too. Judges grew impatient with delays, contradictions, redactions that didn't align, depositions that were missed or postponed under unclear reasons, and finally the court issued an emergency order demanding full disclosure of all communication between Blake, her team, and platforms involving creator suppression. Subpoenas were sent with names, dates, platforms attached, and this time the court expected compliance, not strategy, because the stall tactics were wearing thin and the public pressure was mounting. And what happened next would determine everything. The moment those subpoenas hit the inboxes, the mood shifted not just inside the courtroom, but online across creator communities, across forums, group chats, and silent discords that had for too long watched in silence as their peers got buried by algorithmic manipulation. Suddenly, creators who once hesitated to speak up felt emboldened because this wasn't speculation anymore. This was sworn legal action with timestamps, metadata, and names. And behind those names were choices that had consequences. And while Blake Lively's legal team scrambled to issue motions to quash redact delay and deflect the internet, moved faster, creators released timelines mapped to launch dates, brand deals, takedowns. They started overlaying those timelines with public Instagram posts, Twitter threads with archived tweets and story highlights, and slowly, undeniably, the puzzle pieces began falling into place. And while Blake's inner circle tried to dismiss the momentum as conspiracy, they overlooked one thing. People were angry not just at the idea of manipulation, but at the years of silence, the gaslighting, the strategic elegance that masked something so coordinated, so calculated, that it no longer looked like damage control. It looked like a digital Cold War led by a woman whose smile had sold billions and now stood accused of quietly tearing down the very ecosystem that had once worshipped her. And while legal analysts debated in real time whether the subpoenas would hold, whether discovery would produce anything concrete, creators continued uploading video after video, each with more screenshots, emails forwarded, texts sent in panic or confusion, each new voice overlapping the last, amplifying not just the message, but the trauma, the exhaustion of trying to fight something so invisible, so perfectly curated, that questioning it felt like insanity until now. Because now the evidence was mounting in court, and with every new leak, every new name redacted or revealed, the public sentiment began shifting. What once was disbelief became concern, then anger, then a sense of betrayal that pulsed through every comment section and creator thread. And behind the scenes, things got even more intense because inside the law firms involved in the case, paralegals, assistants, junior counsel were working around the clock trying to make sense of what had started as a simple brand dispute and now looked like a full-blown coordinated defamation and digital suppression campaign. And suddenly, the language in the filings changed, no longer vague phrases like negative brand interference. Now words like intent harm coordination, influence peddling, abuse of digital access. And when one platform suddenly issued a quiet internal audit, creators noticed their own flags and suppression logs start to lift. Engagement began returning, video performance normalized, monetization resumed, as if the system itself was trying to correct something it knew had been compromised. And through all of this, Blake herself remained largely silent, appearing in public only for carefully staged moments, avoiding press questions, ignoring creator outreach, and when a journalist finally caught up to her team at a private gala, and asked if she had any comment about the subpoena revelations. The response was a cold no comment delivered with a glance that said more than any press release ever could. Because what people saw now was not confidence, it was evasion. And in the days that followed, a once adoring fan base began to fracture influencers who once called her their idol. Quietly removed collabs. Others posted vague comments about accountability and truth, and some even began uploading old content. They had once been too scared to post out of fear of retaliation. And what happened next changed everything, because one of those creators included actual internal Slack messages from a now-defunct PR firm that had worked on a campaign Blake had publicly fronted in those messages. Her name wasn't just mentioned. It was involved allegedly approving creator block lists, suggesting language edits on brand responses that included suppression guidelines. And once that message hit Reddit, it exploded. Cross-posted, shared, analyzed, broken down by digital experts who confirmed metadata headers and IP chains, and suddenly deniability became nearly impossible because it wasn't just strategy anymore. It was participation. And this is when the legal narrative truly shifted, when even the most conservative analysts started admitting that if the documents were authenticated, the fallout wouldn't just damage Blake's image, it could expose an entire playbook used by some of the most powerful people in media, and with that exposure would come consequences not just in court, but in contracts, brand deals, influencer trust, and in the way the public engages with celebrity as a whole. And as the hearings began to draw closer with deadlines for responses looming, something even stranger happened. Someone from inside her own ecosystem flipped. It wasn't dramatic, no press conference, no viral tweet, just a quiet court filing listed under seal for witness protection, but legal watchers noted the timing, noted the change in tone from the judge, and when a series of questions in court appeared to reference things never before mentioned in public filings, the speculation was confirmed. Someone close to the team had turned over data, emails, drafts, internal meeting summaries, and while their name remained protected, the implications were massive, because with that insider leak came the possibility of uncovering intent. And in cases like this, intent is everything. And still through all of this, the internet didn't forget Ryan Reynolds. His silence now deafening with fans and critics alike, questioning how someone so media-savvy, so active on social channels could ignore the firestorm erupting in his own household. And when a former agency head posted a now-deleted thread, alleging they had received calls from his team years ago about removing negative mentions tied to his wife's name during certain release windows. The speculation deepened. Screenshots of brand memos surfaced, some allegedly referencing pressure from his team to distance themselves from creators involved in commentary even tangential to the lawsuits. And while his camp refused to comment, the digital world kept receipts, and once they were out there, they stayed forever. And the creators weren't just watching. Now they were documenting. They were filing, archiving, using tools that allowed every data point to be stored and backed up, so that no amount of PR spin could erase what had already become public record. And as those records multiplied, lawyers for the creators began forming a joint committee, an informal legal coalition dedicated to ensuring the truth reached the courtroom without manipulation, delay, or suppression. And that committee began preparing filings of their own, not just as defense, but as counterclaims, alleging harm, loss of income, brand defamation, emotional distress, and long-term algorithmic sabotage. And when a former social media executive agreed to testify anonymously under court seal, the case entered an entirely new phase. The court ordered a special hearing to determine the validity of the digital suppression allegations, and during that hearing, experts from multiple platforms were called in to testify, not officially on behalf of the platforms, but as third-party analysts and digital forensic experts. They presented overlays, graphs, timelines, and then the moment came when one forensic tech expert confirmed that certain creator videos had indeed been flagged within a third-party management system operated by an external agency tied to campaigns that listed Blake Lively as their brand face. And in the courtroom, silence followed that testimony, not because it was shocking, but because it confirmed what thousands had feared for years, that some voices were deliberately silenced, not by chance, not by algorithmic accident, but by design. And as that design became more visible, more creators stepped forward with similar stories, similar timelines, and suddenly what had started as a few voices became a reckoning. And as the reckoning unfolded, It became clear that this was no longer just about Blake Lively, or even about Ryan Reynolds or the agencies they worked with. This was about a system, a deeply rooted machinery that had been operating under the radar for years, manipulating, suppressing, shifting narratives in favor of those who had the means. The image and the media pulled to bend public perception like clay, and while courtrooms across Los Angeles buzzed with whispers and closed-door meetings, the creator world did not wait for verdicts or verdicts delayed. They organized, compiled, backed up years of flagged uploads, wrongful demonetizations, false copyright, strikes, sudden takedowns, and channel warnings that had no clear origin. And slowly they began to find patterns that led back to specific campaigns, specific agencies, and yes, specific timelines that coincided with moments where Blake or her projects were facing backlash or negative coverage. And every one of those patterns added weight to the mounting belief that this wasn't just an unfortunate series of coincidences. This was coordinated reputation laundering built on the silence and shadow banning of smaller voices. And when those voices started compiling all their receipts, their screenshots, emails, the metadata trails that couldn't be erased or denied, it was no longer just speculation. It became undeniable. And that's when the pressure reached the press. The legacy outlets who had until then mostly ignored the drama or echoed PR-safe statements now found themselves flooded with emails, messages, audio recordings, some from ex-interns, others from digital freelancers, who claimed they had worked under NDAs on suppression tasks tied to influencers and brand safety. And among those leaks, one email stood out. It was dated months before the legal battles even began. A short note marked confidential sent from a boutique PR firm directly to a platform moderation contact, and in it the language was chilling, subtle enough to pass as routine, but loaded enough for digital experts to decode. It read, "We'd like to escalate the concern over creator channels spreading disinformation about our client BL and the brand families we're launching this quarter. We believe it's in everyone's best interest to prevent amplification during these sensitive campaign phases." Attached was a list of URLs, video IDs, and channel names the recipients redacted, but the implications now public, and suddenly questions were asked in editorials, op-eds, and newsrooms. Why had no one investigated these backdoor suppression pipelines before? And how many other celebrities had quietly benefited from them? And as the mainstream media finally caught up to the storm, creators didn't slow down. They dug deeper, they crowdsourced data visualizations, they pooled together API logs scraped from years of analytics. They began to notice strange spikes and drops on specific upload days that aligned with red carpet events, brand drops and movie releases involving Blake Lively, and every time the pattern showed a suppression curve, followed by a recovery only after the campaign ended, and then came the most damning moment. A former platform insider anonymously leaked a segment of internal flagging logic, a piece of code that tagged certain content for deboosting based not on explicit violation, but on associative language. Terms, and one of those terms in the list was tied to a campaign code that legal analysts later confirmed matched a launch event where Blake was the featured spokesperson. And when that snippet of code was verified by independent engineers, the backlash against the platform was immediate, massive, and global. Hashtags trended for days. Creators staged upload blackouts. Users flooded comment sections with demands for transparency. And suddenly, the platforms that once felt invincible began issuing statements, clarifying guidelines, promising audits, offering transparency centers. But few believed them anymore because trust once broken, especially in digital spaces, is nearly impossible to repair. And while all this happened, Blake's silence became its own headline. Photos of her smiling at Fashion Week now looked cold, rehearsed, detached from the firestorm her name was engulfed in. And when she finally released a statement, it was too little too late. A carefully worded paragraph, blaming miscommunication, rogue third-party teams, and a misunderstanding of digital influence protocols. It did not land. It did not calm. It did not restore anything. In fact, it made things worse because creators now armed with undeniable proof saw it for what it was, damage control disguised as contrition. And while her team scrambled to shift blame, courts did not blink. Deadlines loomed, hearings were scheduled. And then the big moment came: a court order mandating the release of internal communication, logs between her PR agencies and the platforms, and while parts of it were redacted, enough was visible to shift the tide forever. Emails with subject lines like urgent creator mitigation prep and BL content firewall contained language that painted a picture not just of strategy but of fear. Calculated fear of critique, fear of dissent, fear that her pristine public image might finally begin to fracture. And in response to that fear, they allegedly launched a system of quiet digital silencing that spanned platforms, agencies, and campaigns. And as those logs were read aloud in court, the courtroom sat stunned. Even seasoned legal reporters whispered among themselves, unable to believe the scale of what was now being exposed. And so, as the dust began to settle and the headlines faded from scandal to history, what remained was not just the wreckage of a failed suppression campaign or the unraveling of two of Hollywood's most polished personas. What remained was a movement, a reckoning that had started with whispers in comment sections and ended with testimonies in courtrooms. What remained was the undeniable truth that influence without accountability is dangerous, and silence when weaponized is never innocent. And for Blake Lively and Ryan Reynolds, no amount of charm could mask the damage, no press tour could erase the receipts. No viral video could undo the legacy of manipulation that had now become public record, because creators stood up because they spoke. When they were told to stay quiet because they demanded transparency, when doors slammed in their faces because they refused to disappear just to protect a brand. And in doing so, they shattered the illusion that power only flows one way, they proved. That truth, when carried by many, travels farther than fame ever could. And while Blake and Ryan may try to rebuild their image, to rewrite their roles in this saga, to move on as if the past can be managed like a script the internet remembers, and so do the people, the creators, the viewers, the ones who finally saw behind the curtain and chose to never look away again. Because in the end, this was never just about two celebrities. It was about the line between influence and integrity, and what happens when that line is crossed by those who thought they'd never be caught.